We cannot counterfeit money, we cannot kidnap people, we cannot steal from people's paychecks. However, there's a certain small group of people named the state who are allowed to do all of these things. They can counterfeit money and call it monetary policy. They kidnap people and call it arrest. They steal from people's paychecks and call it taxation. In this book, Professor Huemer explains why political authority, this blank check that we give to public servants to commit crimes, is just an illusion.
All right, so Justin gave a fair summary of what the first half of the book is about. It's about how political authority is an illusion. And what I mean by that is the government and its agents don't really have this kind of special moral status that's ascribed to them. They really are subject to the same moral principles as everyone else. And so the things that they're doing are really morally equivalent to what you would be doing. They're morally equivalent to theft and kidnapping and so on. The second half of the book is about anarcho-capitalism. It's basically arguing that anarchy could work reasonably well. Okay, so I'm going to talk some about that. Libertarians agree that we don't need anything more than a minimal state. Sometimes they disagree about whether we need the minimal state, which is to say whether you need the state to do police, court functions, and national defense. Okay, and so my claim is that we don't need the state for any of those things. I'm going to suggest there's an approach that was suggested by Brian Kaplan for getting people kind of closer to accepting this. It's to point out that in our current system, we have some things that are kind of like the anarcho-capitalist idea. There are right now private security companies. They're called security guards. There are actually more private security guards than there are government police. There are also private courts. We call them arbitrators or mediators. So there are private dispute resolving mechanisms. In fact, there are also some cases in which the government itself will turn to these private alternatives. So there are a few cases where the government will actually hire private security guards instead of their own police. And the reason for that is that it's cheaper. Okay. So that happens at the Liberty Bell, at the Statue of Liberty, and at the main bus terminal in Durham, North Carolina. So now imagine that that practice just became more widespread. So it's already happening now, and nobody thinks that it's a disaster, I don't think. What if they just spread to more and more things? What if eventually it got to the point where actually they're using private security guards everywhere? And so the private security guards could be patrolling every place that's patrolled, right? Now there is a difference between private security guards and police, which is it is possible for a private citizen to arrest someone, but the conditions for that are restricted legally. You have to actually see somebody commit the crime, right? And then you can perform a citizen's arrest. But what if we liberalized the law there and made it so that actually private security people could arrest someone if they had evidence that the person had committed a crime without having actually seen it? Okay, so then that makes them a lot like the government police. Again, not obvious to me why this couldn't happen, why this wouldn't work, right? Similarly, about the court system. There are right now some cases in which the government courts will actually refer you to private arbitration. This happens particularly in some states with auto insurance disputes. So you have an automobile insurance dispute. The government, you try to go to the government court, they will say, no, go to a private arbitrator. They will refer you to some arbitrators. What if the government just expanded this practice? What if they did this for all civil cases? So what if all divorce cases, to start with, were referred to private arbitrators? Not obvious why this couldn't work, not obvious why this would be a terrible idea. Okay, and not obvious why actually they couldn't just expand this to all civil cases, right? Okay, so then you might think, well, what about criminal cases? Now, the thing here is that I don't believe that there should be any distinction between criminal and civil law. See, I believe that the whole point of the law should be to remedy a situation in which somebody has victimized another person. Now, there are some laws that can't be construed that way, and therefore they could not be treated as civil cases. So if somebody is engaged in prostitution, there's no civil case there. There's nobody to sue the prostitute or the customer because nobody's been harmed by it, right? So you would need criminal courts. You would need a civil criminal distinction in order to deal with that if you think that should be illegal, but it shouldn't be illegal, right? So, okay, the only things that should be illegal are the things where there's an actual victim. If there's an actual victim, it looks like then there's somebody can file a lawsuit, okay? Now you might think, oh, well, that's not really good enough because the criminal has to be punished, not just pay some money, right? But actually paying money is a certain amount of punishment, right? And typically what happens is if somebody commits an action that we would think of as a crime, the harm to the victim is much greater than the benefit to the criminal. And that might actually be why we consider those actions crimes. Right? So typically if you steal something, the resale value is much less than the value to the person you stole it from. Right? You can sell it for a fraction of its original value. And so if you're forced to pay compensation, typically you're much worse off. Right? So it seems like there is a sufficient deterrent there. Okay. In addition, of course, you can have the criminal be forced to pay court costs or things like this. Okay. So the idea here is all of the law could be civil law, and there's no obvious reason why the civil law couldn't be handled by private arbitrators. I don't see why this wouldn't work. Okay, now, why would that be better? Why would that be better than the governmental system? Well, I think the arguments here are the same as the arguments for capitalism in general. Why does the free market do better at providing shoes than the government? Well, yeah, the government has two features that differentiate it from private businesses, or most private businesses. One is it's coercive. That is, you can't say you don't want the product, right? If you think of the government as like a business, it's a business that's unusual, different from other businesses in that you don't get to decide whether to buy it, you have to buy it. And second, it's monopolistic. You can't buy it from a different provider instead of this one, you have to buy it from this specific one. That's basically how the government differs from normal private businesses. Do these two features make it better? Really hard to see how you would think that that would make it better, right? Obviously, if you have a coercive monopoly, you have room for abuse, and you have room for the provider just being really bad, right? I mean, on the one hand, they could just give really low quality. They could charge very high prices. They could have lower supply. And then they can just start screwing around in other ways. They can like beat people up and whatever. And basically they can get away with it because you can't say that you don't want the product anymore. You can't fire them because it's coercive. And you can't go to their competitor because there are no competitors because it's a monopoly. Okay. That's what we would say about the provision of shoes, why there shouldn't be a coercive monopoly in shoes. Why wouldn't the same thing be true about security and dispute resolution? So I guess you know, I don't see why the coercive monopoly would be better in that area. See, how long have I been talking now? I think you can make a couple more remarks about whether anarchy is a realistic possibility. So in the book, near the end, I claim that it's realistic that there might be an anarchist society in the future. Right? It's not implausible that at some point in the future there would be an anarcho-capitalist society. Right? And my reasoning for this is mostly because, first of all, I think the theory is true. The theory of anarcho-capitalism is true. You have to read the whole book to see that. And in particular, I think political authority really is an illusion. And I think that there's intellectual progress over time. So over time, people get better and better ideas. And just if you look centuries and millennia ago at the things that people were doing and the things that people were thinking, it was much, much worse than today. Right? People have gotten better and better, especially evaluative beliefs, right? Moral and political beliefs. Okay? And so my claim is, if I'm right that there really is no political authority, at some point that will probably be generally recognized. At some point it'll be like the way that we now recognize that slavery is unjust. We'll realize that this idea of having some group of people who gets to force everyone else to do their will and just take their money whenever they want to, that's also unjust. And if that becomes generally accepted, it's hard to believe that we're just going to keep doing it. Right? I don't know how it's going to come about, but if it were generally accepted that government is inherently unjust, eventually we would stop having it. Okay. Maybe that's enough. I want to spend most of the time discussing and responding to your questions or comments. Yes?
Okay, there was discussion, you said you don't see any obvious reasons why criminal law can't be treated like civil law. Well, I do. First off, I think that most people, most criminals, probably don't have enough money or means getting money to pay the fine for any serious crime. I do agree with you in terms of, say, theft. You know, that's even in the Bible. Like, if you steal something, you got to pay back 4 times as much. If there's something that's a straight property crime, I could see how that would work, and I think that would probably be preferable in a lot of cases to putting them in jail. But if you're going into violent crime, I don't really think there's a monetary value. It's a blood debt. It's not something that can be monetarily taken care of. And say hypothetically you killed someone, what would be the price of that? I mean, would the person be a slave? What?
It would be a lot.
Well, I mean, so then a millionaire can go around killing people and just pay the fine. I mean, I don't think that's workable. And if you are going to have a situation where there's no way to imprison people unless the person's individually paying for it, I just don't think that's workable to make the person pay for their own protection. I think violent criminals are a threat to society and should be locked up. I think there is a distinction between property crime and crimes of violence, which seem to be compulsive in many cases, and which are simply beyond financial reimbursement.
So just to repeat what she said, basically the question is it possible for a private entity to be able to regulate violent crime? Because that's different than civil disputes, obviously. I mean, that's kind of a summary, obviously, but does that kind of make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Did I explain that right?
Well, so, I mean, it started with, maybe the criminals are not able to pay compensation. Now, I don't really see, I guess I don't see what the principal difference is between property crime and violent crime. I mean,
your body is property, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a common libertarian doctrine that your body is part of your property. Now, some crimes are worse than other crimes. So murder is worse than stealing. Okay, but stealing $1,000 is worse than stealing $100. That doesn't make them different in kind, and it doesn't explain why you shouldn't pay compensation. Now, but there is the question that maybe when you have violent crimes, the compensation would be larger, typically. So, it's possible.
Totally on a different page. I just totally reject that whole, your body's property, that's all it is. No, it's life.
Well,
There's something totally substantial.
I didn't say that's all it is remark, but I did say that it's
But you're treating it as though it's no different.
Yeah. Can you explain what the relevant difference is?
You can get more money. If you're dead, you can't come back to life.
Yes, so if you're killed, you have a larger harm.
You are done. You're not even existing. There's a fundamental, existential, absolute, down to the ground principle difference.
I think you might, so it started out with violent crime, and now it's just specifically about murder. So suppose that you just punch someone. Is there a reason why an appropriate remedy for that would not be compensation?
I think it should be up to the person. The punching a person, there's like you said, there's differing levels of violent crime. Punching someone, it's not that big a deal. There's some, if someone wants to accept, say, $50,000 for being punched in the face, sure, that's fine. But I think it should be up to them. If you got someone who's serially punching people.
What do you mean by up to them? So, what would be the other?
To you to decide what someone else's physical damage.
It wouldn't be up to me. I'm just.
Say I chop your arm off. I decide, that's worth $10. Give him $10. We're done.
Well, it's not up to you either, right?
That's what the state does.
Yeah, it's not up
to you or him.
Right. It wouldn't be up to the criminal. It wouldn't be up to the victim. It would. Well, this is why you have the idea of the private court system. So it would be up to the third-party arbitrator, somebody who was not involved in the original dispute to resolve it.
Can I throw out a concrete example? The father next door, I'm on my private property, he's on his private property in his home, I'm in my home. And the father, I'm watching him rape this child. In your system, I have to sue that guy to prove that that's wrong? In your system, how do you go about having justice in that situation?
If you see somebody committing a crime right now, you would be justified in intervening. You'd be justified in using force to stop them. Now that's true right now in reality, and it would also still be true in the anarcho-capitalist system. Okay, now, but if you just find out that a crime happened in the past, and then you want to do something to the person who committed the crime, yes, then you have to sue them. Now, is there a reason why that's worse than calling the police? So the current system, so we don't have the alternative of the system where God comes down and metes out perfect justice. You have the alternative of the coercive, you call the coercive monopoly, or you call a private security company. Right? So then the question is, why is the coercive monopoly better than a private security company? Right now you might be thinking...
Let's say I go into this situation and I personally intervene, and his wife shoots me. How then does it go forth from there?
Did she kill you?
Yeah, oh yeah, I'm dead.
Okay, well...
My family's really upset about this.
Yeah, then you're dead. And so then there are some people who are, let's say, hot-headed and violent natures, and so sometimes people shoot each other. Sometimes somebody gets mad at another person and shoots the other person. That happens right now in every society, including the societies that have governments, which right now is all of them. Having a government doesn't make that not be the case. That would also presumably that would also still be the case in the anarcho-capitalist society. Then what happens? Well, so then the person who got shot might be dead. So therefore, what? Well, does that mean that the social system is no good? No, because there's no social system that we know how to implement where nobody ever gets killed, right? Now there's a question, do we think that would happen more often in one system than another? So, now I'm not seeing the argument for why it would happen more often in the anarcho-capitalist society.
I don't think that was the point of her question. I think what she was saying, how would that person be dealt with? If she's tried to intervene, she's been killed in the attempt.
Yeah.
Is it just over then? You know, is that they just get away with it because they killed her? I mean,
Precisely because everybody cares about the justice means that there's a demand for the justice. It's like, if everybody needs toothpaste and shoes, then there's a demand in the market for
I don't know if
toothpaste
there is a
and
demand.
So,
But that's your concern, though. You have that concern.
So
Everybody seems to care about, like, isn't this like the minarchists constantly having to defend themselves against, like, well, in your society, children would starve, and I really care about starving children. And the minarchist is always having to say, no, people care about starving children. There's a market to help starving children. There's charities. So in this case, it's the same sort of argument. Like, there is a market and a demand for justice and protection services and insurance against certain things. So that still exists when you have a market to provide that. It's not...
Okay,
It's still not clear
So-
what would actually be done.
that is the sort of theoretical statement, right? If there's something that people want, then, and they're willing to pay for it, then it seems like a private company can provide it. On a more concrete level, if you get wrongfully shot, then your family, friends, or loved ones then can file a lawsuit. If they want to, they can try to be vigilantes and take vengeance, but that is risky. So,
What if they
the
can
better
afford
thing...
the fine?
What?
What if they can afford the fine? Why not?
Yeah. Now, I once heard a talk by Randy Barnett, where Barnett he's also an anarcho-capitalist, although he doesn't use that word. And somebody said, well, what if there's this really rich person, and then they kill someone, and then let's say the price for that is $10 million. And so then the rich person gives $10 million to the family. And then, and the implication was that this is not acceptable because the guy hasn't suffered retribution, right? So Barnett's suggestion was, okay, so the family now has $10 million, which happens to be the price that you have to pay if you kill someone. So now we can just see whether they would rather have the money or the vengeance.
So killing the person is an option then?
So if the family kills the person, then they have to pay back the $10 million. Right?
It's always an option.
But,
I
yeah.
don't know what the punishment
Okay.
is, it's always an option.
Okay, so
One person at a time.
Okay, so we keep talking about this anarchist society that the punishment would be monetary, essentially. But what do you consider to be justice now in the system that we have? Locking somebody up or a death penalty?
Well, if someone is repeatedly killing people, let's say, taking the hypothetical one step further, you have a multi-billionaire who pays $10 million every time he kills someone. He's got a lot of money, he can afford to kill a lot of people. I think in order to protect society, yes, he needs to be locked up.
Okay, so then my next question is,
Not for punishment only.
in an anarchist society, would there be, and I want to know this too, any sort of like quarantining, like locking up, like the people who are...
Yeah, good. Okay, sorry. I think I didn't answer the original question, but more questions keep occurring, so I have a backlog now. Okay, the scenario of the billionaire. Okay, so here's the thing. I intend this to be a realistic idea and a realistic discussion. And when you're evaluating whether anarcho-capitalism is a good idea or not, I think science fiction scenarios are irrelevant. So the question is, what are actual murderers like? What is the actual problem that we're facing? There are no billionaire murderers. And if there was one, also by the way, if there was one who got away with killing several people, that still wouldn't show that the system was no good. We have 16,000 murders in the United States every year. We want there to be less murder. We should think about, in reality, like where most of the murders are coming from. Most of it is drug-related and gang-related. Okay, now, I don't have a plan for eliminating all crime or all murder, but I do have a plan for reducing it a lot compared to the present system, right? Okay, now, the other question was, what happens if the criminal cannot pay the just compensation? So let's say they owe $10 million in compensation, and their net worth is $200. Okay. All right. Now that could possibly happen, right? And the suggestion there is then they go to a forced labor facility. So they go to a private prison, and then they're forced to work at the private prison. Now you might say, but they can never work off their debt, right? Like they're not going to make $10 million in their entire life. So then it becomes the job of the arbitrator to decide how to resolve that. So the arbitrator, in consultation with the victims, may negotiate a settlement where the person pays back as much as they could reasonably be expected, or something like that. Or they could just decide, no, you have to work for the rest of your life.
Or you can have the current system where not only does your family member get killed, you have to pay for the guy if the guy's spending $30,000 a year behind bars, that's how much it costs to jail somebody for a year, and you're paying to house that guy in a jail. So that's a really great system where not only do you suffer murder, you have to actually pay money to the guy who's being jailed.
Basically put the guy in welfare.
Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, comment, yeah.
Okay, great. First, I'd like to comment on Justin's comment. I think it's more like $42,000 a year to incarcerate an inmate in federal prison. But my question is for you, sir. In the pendulum of the power of the market versus, I guess, corruption, coercion, force, why would, if we lost our current system of governance, why would not the mightiest or strongest power not take over immediately next, and thus perpetuate the cycle of governance and monopoly of force?
Yeah, good. So, when I talk about anarcho-capitalism in my classes, most of the class are not even capitalists. They're far from libertarian, right? They don't even understand why capitalism is a good system. So most of them, I don't know about most of them, but a lot of them have this belief that capitalism inherently leads to monopolies, right? And that's one of the big reasons why you need a government, to stop the monopolies. Now, so I'm just going to assert that that is false. It is very difficult to establish a monopoly in a free market system. You basically need to have a government to establish a monopoly in most cases. Now, so what about the security industry in particular? Would there be a monopoly of that? Right, well, since it's extremely difficult in general to establish monopolies, not clear why you would think that there would be a monopoly in this area. Right, now, there are suggestions that people have made about how you get the monopoly, right? But, well, maybe you want to just comment on that.
Yeah, I do. I don't think it's extremely difficult to implement a monopoly on the use of force, because history has shown that governments have a very successful rate of implementing themselves on the population.
Yeah.
And certainly, the recent history has shown that even when a revolution happens, a new government somehow finds a way to birth its life and monopolizes the use of force in that given area.
Okay, good. So here's a possible argument. I don't know if this is exactly what you're saying, but here's a possible argument. Anarchism is not a realistic possibility, because throughout human history, in the beginning there were no governments, now there are governments everywhere. Now every person in the world is living under a government. That shows that the no government situation is unstable and just inherently evolves towards government. So whether it's a good idea or not, it's not feasible, right? There's a thought. So I'd like to suggest that, so although that the background historical claim is kind of true, I want to suggest that the world might be changing in relevant ways. So I'll mention that as of the year 1800, there were 0 countries that counted as democratic by modern standards. Right. Today, it's about half the world. So democracy has been spreading, and it seems like eventually it will take over the world. In the year before the American government was founded, somebody could very well have argued, look, democracy can't work. There's no historical precedent, whatever. Now that's just one thing, but this is part of a larger trend towards moral progress over human history. Okay. So, and I could cite many examples of how there's been enormous moral progress. Okay, now my claim is the reason why we have government now is that almost everyone thinks that they need it. So if today the government were to abdicate, if they all say, okay, we're quitting, almost everyone would think we need a new government, and so then they would set it up. Right? So I believe that we have to change people's minds before we can possibly get to anarchy. Okay, I'm going to get you.
35 years ago or so, there was a debate between anarchists and minarchists, perhaps, and I think the summary of that debate, I think, was given by the issue that we don't know. We don't know if anarchism is inherently as practical or unpractical as is claimed by both sides, perhaps. I don't know if your book goes into this issue or debate. So that's the first question. Second question, Steven Pinker's In Ages of Our Better Nature kind of documents the rise and change of new standards, the adoption of new standards of humanism, let's call it, or decreasing violence in human institutions. And that came out, I think last year, and your book did roughly. Would you claim it as a source of support or criticism?
Yeah, good. So with the two-part questions, I forget the first part by the time the second part has been asked.
Nozick, anarchist taking utopia debate.
Okay, so let me address the thing about Steven Pinker. Yeah, I mean, what I was saying there about moral progress, that's a lot of what the Pinker book is about. Now, the subtitle is How Violence Has Declined, but it's more than just violence, right? So, there's a big decrease in violence in various areas, in war, in individual murder, but also there's things like slavery was widely practiced throughout human history. It's now illegal everywhere in the world. It's not exactly violence. There's racism and sexism. In the 1960s, black people had to go to different schools. Now that's not exactly violence. It's not exactly that violence declined. It's just that people's values have become more liberal. So, and Pinker does talk about some of these things, the things other than just violence. Okay, the first thing you said was something about there's a debate about anarchy versus anarchist versus minarchist.
Watchman State.
So, and then you mentioned Robert Nozick. And yeah, in his book, In Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick has an explanation of why anarchy would be unstable and it would evolve into government. Okay, so I'm going to just very briefly say, so the explanation is, if you have a conflict between two security agencies, the larger agency wins the conflict. And therefore, more people want to sign up with the larger agency, which causes it to become larger. And so the claim is that then there's a natural monopoly, right? People just, more and more people move to larger agencies until you have one that dominates the entire industry. Okay, why is this wrong? First, the reason you hire a security agency is not to fight other security agencies. A security agency is supposed to apprehend criminals, not other security agencies. Second point, important point, is typically violent conflict is harmful to both parties, even the party who wins. Right? If you have a violent conflict, especially if you're running a company and like you have a shootout with the other company, both of you are worse off even if you won the shootout, right? Because the harm done by the violence is greater than whatever was in dispute. Okay, so you probably, the security agencies probably don't want to go to war, and then, you know, that gets rid of Nozick's scenario for how you get the monopoly. Okay.
First off, I want to apologize for getting a bit agitated. I don't mean to, and it's not personal. But the question I've been wanting to ask is, you throw things out there like, oh, it's $10 million if you kill someone, or where, okay, question, and it's basically a one-point question, but has a couple of points. Where would these penalties come from? Would they be voted upon? Would they be, you'll hire a person and you get to decide what the penalties are if you're on your estate? Is it like you have your own little island of a country that's you, and you can come up with your own laws and people just respect them?
Yeah, good question. So what's the origin of law in the anarcho-capitalist society, right? Well, so there are two ideas about this. One is there can be associations of property owners who adopt a code of law for that property. So you can have a homeowners association that says, okay, so here are the rules in this neighborhood. Okay, the other idea is just the common law, which would apply in case there wasn't a relevant written law, right? So in case you have a dispute that's not covered by the homeowners association's rules or whatever. Okay, so, and the way the common law works is, well, two people have a dispute, they take it to a third party who's neutral and ask the third party to resolve it. And why do they do this? Because usually resolving it that way is better than resolving it through violence. Right? Because again, usually the violent resolution is worse for both parties, even the party who's stronger. So, and that is the actual origin of most law. Right? That is, an individual judge, somebody was asked to resolve a dispute, and then they gave an answer and then they explained their rationale. Right? Which is basically based upon kind of the accepted moral values of their community. And then other arbitrators in the future look at that decision in making their own decisions. Right? We know that this works because that's where the common law actually came from. Yeah, so two problems, right? One, what if you kill somebody who doesn't have insurance? And presumably you don't just get away with it, so you still have to have somebody who decides how much that's worth. But second, if the insurance company gets to recover the cost, then actually they don't have to charge you any premiums, right? So you could just insure yourself for $100 billion.
It would cost a lot. It would cost you a lot.
No, I mean, well,
And
sorry, that's why I made the prefatory remark. If the insurance company gets to recover the cost from the criminal, so they paid out the $10 million, if they get to recover the $10 million from the criminal, okay, then that's in addition to the premiums you paid. So actually they didn't have to charge you premiums. Or they could have charged very, nominal premiums, right? Which means that then there's an incentive for people to insure their lives for much more than it's actually worth, or a ridiculously large amount, or to insure it for as much as could be collected. Right? Okay. Well, whatever. Yeah, but I mean, I didn't think that the problem was that bad anyway. Look, there's no system in which God comes down and resolves disputes and gives us the correct answer. Every social system that we're going to have is going to involve human beings making decisions as to what they think is the right thing to do. So there's no question about whether we should have that, whether you should have a human deciding what the remedy should be. The only question is who it should be. Should it be this coercive monopoly organization who decides what the remedy is, or should it be a competitive organization that decides?
That was very well said. Thank you.